Today's workshop is What Parents, Families, and Caregivers Need to Know About Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports. I'm excited to introduce you to Amy Wheeler-Sutton, who is the co-director of the Building Effective Supports for Teaching, BEST, and Vermont Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, VTPBIS, project at the University of Vermont. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Karen. Happy to be here. I'm just going to get my slides up, and I won't multitask because I'll probably make a mistake. So I'll stop talking for a second. Okay, I'm just going to pull that over onto my other screen. All right, does that look all right? Okay. So like Karen mentioned, I'm Amy Wheeler-Sutton. I'm the co-director of the BEST project with Cassandra Townsend, who's on the line to help me out in the background today. We are housed at the University of Vermont, and we are largely funded by the Agency of Education with a small project from the Department of Mental Health. And we're housed in the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion within the College of Education at UVM. So that's where you can find us, though we're virtual most days. And the BEST project has been charged with training, coaching, technical assistance around positive behavioral interventions and supports since 1997. So we now have about 170 schools in Vermont who have been trained and are implementing PBIS at various levels throughout the state. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about why you're here today. So if you can type into the chat box, just a quick message, maybe who you are, who you represent, whether you're a parent or you work for a school or a designated agency, and then just what brings you to this webinar today. What are you hoping to get out of it? Great. Thanks so much, Katie. Great. Thank you, Monica. We have a close colleague who works at NFI. Great. Thanks, Patricia. Give just another minute for people to chime in if they'd like in the chat box. Great. All right. Well, feel free to keep typing in the chat box if you haven't finished your message yet, and I'll get caught up in a second. But we're hoping that we're going to cover some basics about what PBIS is and isn't. The role of family engagement in PBIS is specifically the focus of this webinar. We're going to discuss a few ways that schools can incorporate family perspectives, values, and voices within their PBIS implementation, and then how parents and families can actively contribute to fostering a positive school environment for their child's school and how they can support their individual child in their educational journey. So like I said, we'll start with a kind of PBIS 101. So if you could just type in the chat box, a 1, I know a lot about PBIS, a 2, I know a little bit, or 3, I'm just learning. And that'll help me kind of gauge how long to spend on different introductory elements. Oh, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Great. All right, so most people are pretty new to PBIS, so hopefully this introduction will be helpful to you. Feel free to ask questions in the chat box as we go along, and I'll either pause right then and answer it if it's something really pertinent right then, or I'll save the questions and Karen's going to give them to me at the end to answer. So we'll just begin with kind of a definition of what is PBIS. And you'll see here, we're calling it school-wide PBIS. So PBIS is intended to be implemented school-wide, not just classroom by classroom or for individual students. And it is a framework. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. And specifically a prevention framework. So we're not going to wait for challenges to occur. We're going to put a lot of preventative things into place so that we can hopefully create school environments that are safe and effective for student learning to occur. So I mentioned it's a framework, and that really means that schools are intended to tailor that framework to their unique context. So if you walk into different schools within the state who are implementing PBIS, it's going to look different from school to school because of that need to tailor and make sure you're meeting your students where they're at and incorporating the values of the community that you're in. It offers a continuum of evidence-based practices. So you'll see the visual on the right. We really are helping schools when we're training them to develop some systems. We'll talk more about what that means, to be able to embed some evidence-based practices that are going to help support students' social, emotional, behavioral learning, mental health, well-being. And we're going to continually look at data to make sure what we're doing is working, and always having equity at the center. So we'll talk a little bit more about that visual in a minute. But what we're really looking for when we implement PBIS well is to have an impact on outcomes. And that would be social, emotional, behavioral outcomes, as well as academic outcomes, because we know that when students are successful socially, emotionally, behaviorally, then that's going to lead to improved academic outcomes. They're going to have the skills that they need to be able to engage with their academics more successfully. So Cassandra added a link into the chat box. You'll see that any of the slides that have links here, she'll be putting a link into the chat box, but you're also going to get this as a PDF, so you don't feel like you have to click on any links while you're watching the webinar. You can get those later if you'd like. But you'll see that this one goes to pbis.org. So PBIS is actually implemented across the country, I think in something like 27,000 schools or something. So there's a lot of great resources on the pbis.org website, which is a National TA Center website. So like I said, when we train schools, this is really our framework that we build from. So we're helping them to develop the systems that are needed in order to support staff behavior and staff implementation of PBIS. We're helping them select and consider how they might select some evidence-based practices to put into place. And we're really looking for those practices that can be easily implemented with a small amount of effort that's going to give schools the biggest, most durable effect. So kind of the biggest bang for their buck, so that we know that schools are very overwhelmed and have a lot going on. And so we don't want them to have to develop these really complex school-wide interventions when something simpler might work and take fewer resources. And then, like I said, they're intended to be collecting a variety of data sources to be able to support their decision-making. So for instance, if they are doing a school climate survey, that might illuminate some areas of need within the school that would then help them to select a practice that would help get at that. So for instance, typically one of the lowest rated items on the school climate surveys in Vermont is the question, I like school, which is always really sad for us to see that students are rating that lower across the board. Elementary and middle school is generally what we've been analyzing in terms of results. And so a school might look at that, a team might look at that and say, okay, this is really an issue. How can we change that answer to have more of our students be enjoying the school that they're walking into every day? What practices can we put into place? So this kind of Venn diagram is kind of constantly in motion for schools to consider what changes they might need to make. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means for schools to have equity at the center of their PBIS work and how we're kind of evolving to make that more of a focus. And again, we're doing all of this to improve the social and academic outcomes for all of our students. The reason that PBIS kind of came about in the first place is because traditional approaches to discipline were proving pretty ineffective. So schools were seeing behaviors that interfered with learning, with social supports, and instead of doing anything preventative, they were just simply reacting, putting out fires, putting kind of punishment or consequences into place that were non-constructive, non-restorative, and weren't actually changing behavior. Schools were doing things kind of piecemeal with pretty poor implementation fidelity, and therefore we're not getting the effects that we were looking for. So that's where PBIS kind of came from to the start, to be an alternative to those traditional discipline practices. And since it's been begun in around 1997 in Vermont, there are some misapplications or misconceptions that have come about that we're hoping to dispel today as well. So like I said, it's going to be tailored to schools' community, so their unique context. So it's not a packaged curriculum. When they come to our trainings, we don't hand them a binder and say, here's how you implement PBIS, go. It's a process of schools looking at their needs and developing and building out their framework from what is identified within their building. It's not a scripted intervention. It might include some scripted interventions as a practice. So for instance, schools may select a social emotional learning curriculum that they want to embed within their PBIS implementation so that all schools are getting, all students are getting social emotional learning curriculum at that tier 1 universal level for everyone. And that might be a scripted curriculum that teachers are using. But PBIS is much larger than just an intervention or a curriculum. It's not a manualized strategy, and it's not simply a reward system. So that's one of the biggest misconceptions, is that PBIS is equivalent to a reward system. So acknowledging positive student behavior is one component of PBIS, which we'll talk about, all of the different components. But that is one of the challenges with the best way to train schools in PBIS, and how we do that across the state is that a leadership team from the school comes to our training, and then they're responsible for bringing that information back to the rest of the school. And sometimes what we've seen is that when that information gets translated back to the larger staff, all that kind of gets communicated is about the acknowledgement system. And that really does a disservice to the students, to the name of PBIS, because we know that when you're implementing the full framework, it really is much more powerful than just simply implementing an acknowledgement system. So this is kind of the elevator pitch that we give schools to adapt, so that when they are asked, well, what is PBIS? They have an answer kind of at the ready that helps explain really that full framework, and that it is really about that social, emotional, behavioral support for staff, for students, and that we're really always having those outcomes in mind right from the beginning to build positive and equitable school environments, and to see outcomes from what we're doing. So this is just a brief quote from Rob Horner, who was one of the co-founders of the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center back at the beginning. And what he said, and what we kind of always come back to, is that the fundamental purpose of PBIS is to make schools more effective and equitable learning environments. So that's really what we're training schools to do, and hoping that they are seeing that when they have a strong PBIS framework, they are seeing that their school environments are becoming more effective and equitable. And I just wanted to add, and safe, because I think that's really one of our key focuses as well. So you might have noticed that within that visual with systems, data, and practices, that we're really working hard to keep equity at the center of everything we're doing. And what we know is that PBIS is not actually fully implemented until it is culturally responsive. So we're thinking about how can we incorporate the voice of students, of family caregivers, of staff to really make sure our implementation is matched to our school community, that we're teaching students about the difference between how behavior might look within the school, within the community, in their homes, and how something that's really quite acceptable at home might not be an acceptable behavior at school, and why that difference exists. That we're disaggregating our data to be able to make sure that our outcomes are seen across the board, and that none of our student groups are falling short, and that if they are, we're adapting our implementation to make sure that that is not the case, and kind of closing that opportunity gap and achievement gap. That we're building a supportive environment for all of our students, that everyone feels welcome and a sense of belonging, and that their identities are honored, and that staff understand how their identities show up within their interactions with students, and that they are open to learning more about their students' and families' identities. So I see a few questions coming into the chat box. I'm going to keep going for now, and then pause in a few minutes to look at those. So when we're training schools in PBIS, we're helping them to think through whether all students have access to that universal level of PBIS, that they are, for instance, if they are a student with a disability, they are still part of the classroom, part of that Tier 1 universal social skills instruction that's happening, that they're a part of those school-wide expectations, school-wide celebrations, that just because they may be receiving additional layers of support, that doesn't mean they don't also need the universal level. We're also thinking about representation and meaningful participation, so that we are including all of those diverse voices, so that implementation doesn't just look like what the administrator thinks that it should look like, or that leadership team thinks that it should look like, that your leadership team is more representative of your school community, and that many different voices have the ability to influence implementation, and that it's really representative of the school community, what implementation looks like. And that we're really striving for high outcomes for all. And again, that includes looking at that disaggregated data so that we make sure that all student groups are experiencing success. So I mentioned a few times that universal or Tier 1 level or layer. And we're really looking, when we first encounter a school that's looking to implement PBIS, to train schools at the universal level. And so that means putting those universal practices into place across the school, in all settings, in all classrooms, on the playground, at lunch, everywhere. And we know that when those universal practices are in place for all of our students, those good preventative, proactive, evidence-based practices, that about 80% of our students will see success just accessing those universal level of supports. But we know that there are always going to be students who need some additional supports in order to be successful at school. And so what we're hoping to see is that when schools develop those really strong Tier 1 supports, that about 10 to 15% of their students might still need some targeted level supports. They might be at risk of developing some more complex or severe behaviors, but we want those Tier 2 supports to be really readily available for students, so that it's kind of an off-the-shelf intervention that we don't have to develop a whole complex behavior plan for a student. Once we see that they might be in need of some additional supports, we want to be able to slide them into that intervention as soon as possible. So a very common tier 2 intervention is check in, check out, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But we know that even when those tier 2 interventions are in place and that we're trying to catch students early, we know that about 1 to 5% of our students are still going to need intensive supports. So those are students that have really complex needs. They might be accessing supports from a variety of providers. And so that might include something like a functional behavioral assessment, a behavior support plan, a wraparound team that's really doing hard work around a student. And we know that those level of supports are really resource intensive. And so that's why we want to make sure that those tier 1 supports are really strong, so that we are not expending those resources on students that don't really need them, that they would have been able to be successful with just tier 1 or tier 2 supports, that we're really reserving those tier 3 supports for the students who are most in need, because we will burn out our education staff if we are trying to provide tier 3 supports to too many students, and to students who may not necessarily need that level of intense support. And what we're always kind of reminding schools that if they are seeing those inequitable outcomes when they disaggregate their data, that really is a tier 1 issue. That's not about, well, those students just are not learning in this environment. How can we really adapt and modify the environment so that all of our students can be successful at tier 1? We're also really careful when we train schools to constantly be reiterating that we are labeling supports, not students. So we are hoping that no schools are out there calling students our tier 2 students or our tier 3 students or our red zone students. Because we know that students need a continuum of support across different areas of their school experience. So for instance, this student might be really successful with their peer interactions, with their reading, but when we're looking at their math skills, their social emotional regulation skills, that's where they're needing that intensive level of support. That doesn't mean that they are an intensive student. And so we're really helping schools to kind of reframe that, to give them some scripts to use, that if they're hearing that language in school, how they can help reframe it within their staff. Because we know that that kind of conversation can really limit students and limit adults' kind of mindset about where students are. And we know that this is fluid. Someone may need intensive level support around emotional regulation in first grade, but that doesn't mean that they are always going to need that high level of support. So Karen mentioned being interested in kind of learning about the outcomes of PBIS. So these are the national outcomes. So we're seeing improvements both for student outcomes, but also teacher outcomes, which I think is not often talked about as much, and reduced use of exclusionary discipline, such as office referrals, suspension, seclusion restraint, and racial inequities within exclusionary discipline. In terms of the student outcomes, what we're seeing is improved academic achievement, improved use of pro-social behaviors, improvements in attendance, et cetera. And for teachers, when PBIS is implemented well in the building, teachers feel more effective. They don't feel like they're grasping at straws to be able to help support their students or have strong classroom environments, which is really improving their well-being and the climate and safety of the school building. And we do the best we can to analyze results across Vermont in our annual report, which you also can find on our website, and has some more information about Vermont level outcomes when implementing with PBIS with Fidelity. The pandemic has made it challenging to really look at those outcomes in a effective way across the state. But individual schools are doing really hard work to examine their outcomes and make adaptations to their implementation to make sure that all of their students are showing improvement. So when we're talking about PBIS at the universal level, this is what schools are developing. So they begin by looking at a statement of purpose. What are they hoping that PBIS is going to accomplish within their building? What are they hoping that the team who kind of holds that PBIS work is going to do to make sure that that happens? So we kind of start with that purpose and vision in mind from the beginning. And we help them to tie that to the school or district mission or vision statement. And then we help them to kind of co-create some expectations or agreements with their school community about what do they want their school to look like and feel like. So you may have been in a school that has expectations such as we are caring, safe, and responsible. So those are those kind of overarching expectations or agreements that schools are hoping that everybody who kind of interacts with the school community is striving toward. And then in order for them to be able to meet those expectations or agreements, we know that we have to teach and practice those pro-social behaviors and to a place of fluency. So we'll talk more about how schools do that. And then they develop an acknowledgement system that's used school-wide to be able to provide feedback about how students are doing in their learning of those pro-social behaviors. And one other misconception about PBIS is that it's really all just about the positive, and that that's not realistic. But that is not the case. When schools come through training, we're also helping them to develop systems to have in place to both prevent and then respond instructionally and restoratively when interfering behaviors occur, and to really build out that continuum of supports. And then, like I mentioned a few times, really coming back to that data to be able to make decisions. So we're going to talk a little bit more about each of these components. So the first one is those school-wide expectations. We want schools to pick a few, so either 3 or 4 overarching expectations that are really clear, simple, positively worded, that they're going to use school-wide. And that those expectations are defined, they're posted throughout the building, they're taught explicitly, students have lots of opportunity to practice, and that they are acknowledged, so they understand when they are showing those expectations. Back in the day, when we first started training schools in PBIS, we didn't really have a mechanism for understanding the best ways to elicit feedback about those expectations. And so they often were kind of developed in isolation. That leadership team that came to training would kind of be, sitting in the training, trying to come up with what those expectations are. And we know that that is not best practice and is not necessarily leading to expectations that really reflect the values of the whole school community. So now the way that we train schools is kind of backing that process up to before they come to the training, using some different methods of getting that staff, student, and family caregiver voice to give input into those school-wide expectations, so they really feel like they fit that school community and that everyone is coming to agreement of, yes, this is what we want our school to look like and sound like, and this is what we're really focused on. So you can see this is an example of what a teaching matrix might look like. And you can see that this is kind of one step further about helping students to think about what that expectation might look like at school, at home, and with their friends. And how those expectations might be different across different settings and what that might mean. So for instance, under We Are Respectful, with their friends, that looks like texting back within 30 seconds. That's a respectful behavior for their friend group. At school, that's not possible for them to be in that frequent of communication with friends. And so kind of illuminating those differences for students can help to bring that to the surface and help them understand the difference in expectations between environments. It's not that it's wrong that with their friends that's an expectation, but how might that interfere with their learning environment? You can see they're all positively worded for at school. So we're not saying stop don't run, or don't push, right? We're showing students what we are hoping they are to do, to have a successful school environment, not simply telling them what to stop doing. And you'll see on the left-hand side, the example matrix actually has expectations as be safe, be respectful, be responsible. And how we're training schools now is that we really want to think about that language and how that kind of translates to it being a really top-down, adult-driven process of you will be safe, you will be respectful to us as adults, which is really not what is intended. It's really that we're building the school environment that feels safe, respectful, and responsible. And so that simple kind of shift in language from be to we are can really help start to shift that mindset, is that we are all working toward these expectations and agreements within our school. So there's a lot of nuances like that we're kind of helping schools to grapple with in ways that they may not have before. And it's challenging, it's different, but we really believe that that's going to lead to improved implementation and improved outcomes. And the key is we're really hoping to teach these pro-social behaviors just as explicitly as we do our academics. So just like we do for academics, having lesson plans, having opportunities for students to see what it looks like, to have some role modeling, to have some practice, and then to get feedback. Because some of these are fine line kinds of things. And so it's easy to see why students have challenges, why they have behaviors that are interfering with their learning, because we're not assuming that all students are coming into the school building knowing how their behavior impacts others, how their behavior impacts their own learning. And so we really want to explicitly teach that. And that's actually a really trauma-informed practice, to not assume that anybody coming into the school environment has an understanding of those behaviors or knows how to behave in that way. We also want to, like I said, give lots of opportunities for practice and practice in that natural context. So rather than just explaining to the kindergartners what the expectations in the cafeteria are, that first week of school, we're going to really break it down for students in that natural context of the cafeteria. We're going to show them exactly where they're getting their tray from. We're going to show them how they can look the person in the eye and thank them for giving them the food. We're going to teach them how to punch their number into the computer. We're not going to assume that they will know how to do that and wait for them to fail and then try to correct that behavior. We're going to teach it up front. And it's kind of this shift in mindset, right? We know that when a student doesn't know how to read or swim or multiply or drive, our natural response is to teach them how to do that. For some reason, when it's about behavior, our natural instinct is to punish when they don't know how to do it. So we're really helping schools to kind of shift that mindset and realize that we need to teach these skills just like we teach all the other skills within our school building. And just like we give feedback about math skills and reading skills, we want to give students feedback about their social emotional behavioral skills to improve that pro-social behavior. And that's going to look different from across different schools, but we're looking for that acknowledgement system to be positive. So students should never be having to give back something that they have earned. And that this is a really well thought out acknowledgement system that's not doing harm to anyone. The reason we have an acknowledgement system, one of the reasons we have an acknowledgement system, is that adult attention is very often drawn toward those negative or challenging or interfering behaviors. We want to shift that mindset and shift what adults are looking for to look for the positive and to be naming the positive out loud. So really giving that positive specific feedback to students rather than just constantly correcting their behavior. Because we know that when we put more emphasis on acknowledging the behaviors we want to see, rather than just correcting those interfering behaviors, that's really where that behavior change happens. So we're changing that adult behavior to be able to change our students' behavior. We know that behavior is learned and that it's facilitated by that guided feedback. And that positive feedback actually has a greater likelihood of shaping a behavior than negative feedback. So especially, if you think back to 2-year-olds running through the library in town, just asking them to stop running or to be quiet without giving them that replacement behavior of, oh, we have walking feet, or we use our eyes to look at the bulletin boards. We want to make sure they know what we actually are expecting of them, not just what we're not expecting of them. And then, like I mentioned, we help schools develop a system for preventing and responding to behaviors instructionally. So what are classroom teachers, what are recess monitors doing, bus monitors doing to prevent interfering behaviors from occurring in the first place? So do we have adequate adult supervision in places? Are the adults kind of walking through, giving that positive feedback, having positive interactions with students, asking them how their day is going, rather than just intervening when interfering behaviors occur? Helping them to distinguish between minor behaviors that can kind of just simply be corrected, or maybe giving students 2 choices between what's going to happen next, and really simple interactions, and what really does constitute a major behavior that's causing the environment to feel unsafe. And then what are the responses that are going to be in place depending on what kind of behaviors they're seeing. And then how can they respond in a way that is instructional, that is allowing students to learn from what just happened, rather than just punishing or giving a consequence for their behavior. And then when we do see interfering behaviors occurring, what supports do we have to put into place so that we can elevate those levels of supports depending on the behavior that we're seeing? So some schools use a system called SWIS, School-Wide Information System, to be able to collect those interfering behaviors that are occurring, and then make decisions based on that. So they might look at time of day that behaviors are occurring, or day of the week, or grade level, location, which behaviors are they seeing across the school, and put some interventions into place. So maybe it feels like everything's just really chaotic and student behavior is really challenging. And then they look at their data and they see, oh, really, it's just the cafeteria that feels really chaotic. And they're able to put, an intervention into place. Maybe it's, the 4th and 5th graders' time during the lunchroom, and what can they do to make some changes during that time. And then briefly, we'll just talk a little bit about the, so data is collected via logged green sheets. So it depends on the school, how they develop their data systems. Not all of them use Swiss, not all of them use a kind of paper form. The biggest shift that we try to train is that whatever it is that they're using to document the behavior, that's not an intervention, and that shouldn't be a response. So students shouldn't necessarily even know. Like sometimes we'll hear something like, oh, that we gave them a green sheet. Well, that's not an intervention. That's a documentation process so that you can keep track and make changes. So a really simple example of that is maybe a student is having to leave the classroom because they're having a behavioral outburst every day at 10:30 in the morning. And you know that now because you've been tracking their behavior for 2 weeks, and you can see that that's when it's happening. Maybe they're hungry and that's why they're having that behavioral outburst at that time. Could they be given a snack? And then look at that data a week from now. Has that behavior changed? So we're encouraging staff to write down the behavior. It's not a write up for the student, right? It shouldn't be considered a punitive thing for the student. That behavior is being documented in a more systematic way. So like I mentioned, we know that those targeted interventions are needed. So schools develop a menu of targeted interventions for students who might need some additional supports. Something that might trigger a school to realize a student needs additional supports is that data collection system. So they may notice that a student has gotten two we call them behavior observation and data forms. It's a terrible acronym, BODFs. But the school may notice that a student is starting to have some more behaviors within a certain environment or during a certain time of day, and that might trigger a need for some additional supports, or when it's requested by a staff member, by a family member, or by the student themselves that they've identified that they're really struggling. Then most schools have a targeted team that meets and is able to match an intervention to that student need based on the function of their behavior. So if we notice that students are really seeking that extra connection with adults, and they might be doing it in a way that is not best suited for the school environment, how can we provide them with that additional adult connection in a way that is more pro-social? So for instance, check and check out allows them to have more frequent interaction with their teacher and with a preferred person outside of the classroom to be able to get more frequent feedback and more frequent adult interaction. So that's a really common one for when students are showing that they need that additional adult connection or support during the day. And like I mentioned, those targeted supports are going to occur in conjunction with the universal level support. So just because a student needs targeted intervention right now doesn't mean they're not going to get those universal supports anymore. And then intensive level supports, we're really providing some resources to get to the root of those behavioral challenges. What are the emotions behind it? What are students feeling about themselves, about the school environment? And how can we improve their experience? So why is that behavior occurring? What's the function? And how can we meet their need in a different way? So developing a really well thought out behavioral plan that involves everyone who interacts with that student throughout the day, so that everyone knows that common language that really helps the student, those maybe coping strategies that have been taught to the student, so that they're not receiving supports in isolation. So for instance, they may be getting one-on-one counseling, but if those strategies that the counselor is giving the student are not making their way to the families, to the classroom teacher, to the specialist teachers, that student's not likely to see many changes in their ability to access those coping strategies. So when we're seeing a student needing intensive level of support, it's really bringing that team together to develop a comprehensive plan that follows the student throughout their day. So what can we do to change the learning environment to prevent the behavior from occurring? So for instance, maybe we know that when a student has had a really challenging morning with their family, they have a rough start to their day. Maybe we have a mechanism for the family letting the school know that in a discreet way and allowing that student to, have 10 minutes with the counselor at the beginning of the day to really reset and make a plan for how they're going to have a successful day at school. So they haven't had any challenging behavior yet at school, but we know it's likely based on their past patterns. What can we do to prevent that behavior from occurring in the first place? How can we teach the student some replacement behaviors to use? So for instance, maybe a student is running from the classroom when they experience uncomfortable feeling in the classroom. Maybe they're realizing they don't know how to do the math that everyone else is doing, and so they just run. Well, maybe our first step is, can we get that student to run somewhere reliable so that the student is not running throughout the building, they're running to their safe place, right? It's not the behavior we're ultimately looking for, which is that the student is doing their math, but it's that replacement behavior they can use in the meantime that is safer, that is still getting their need met, and that we can continue to work on them with. And how can the adults respond differently to reduce the intensity of their behavior? So if we know what escalates a student, we want to make sure that no one in the building is doing that to help alleviate that behavior. And then lots of data monitoring. So checking our progress, did the plan work? And if not, revising it.
Amy,
Yes.
just wanted to do a time check. We're at 11:18 and there are some questions. So not sure that we wanted to take a break and address those.
Yeah, let's do
Um,
it at 11:20. So I'll just slide through the
okay.
next few slides. And you've got the PowerPoint. And depending on your role, the next few slides will be more or less helpful. So if you're in a school, these are some examples of how you can move toward this engagement of families rather than simply involving families. So we really want to kind of shift on that continuum to engagement, where there's really that two-way communication and input and feedback. There's some reasoning behind why we would want to do that. How might that look for children who are receiving tier 2 and tier 3 supports, and some examples. So a feedback and input survey, stakeholder survey, school climate survey. We have lots of kind of resources available for schools of how they can get voice in that way. And then some ideas about how they can get voice in other ways, because we know that not all of our families are going to engage in something like a survey. So some ideas there. And then a resource for teams, school teams to use to see how they're doing within this area of family caregiver engagement. And then just some ideas for families and parents about what they might be able to do. So firstly, learning whether your child's school has been trained in or is implementing PBIS. So we have a link there to all of the schools that have been trained in Vermont. You could volunteer to be on your school's PBIS Universal team, or ask if your child can be. So students should also be included on the Universal team. If your student is getting tier 2 or tier 3 supports, actively participating in those meetings, and then looking out for those PBIS components that we mentioned, asking your child, how do these things feel within your classroom, and providing feedback to the school about whether you see these things in place or how your child experiences them, raising any concerns with your child's teacher or administrator, and also not just concerns, but also celebrating successes. So letting teachers know when you're seeing something like this happening in the classroom that's really helping your child, and considering using some common language at school so that school and home kind of have a similar feel. So there's just some resources linked for you here at the end. And then happy to move to questions that have been asked in the chat. And then we got a few questions in advance as well.
Okay, thanks, Amy. And we can run longer and folks can, feel free to jump off at 11:30. But since this is recorded, if Amy doesn't mind, we can go over and then the whole thing will be available.
Great.
So I think, Amy, we had a couple that came in beforehand. I think your last slide might have covered it, but how can we better understand if this is being implemented in the classroom, and what can we do when it isn't?
Yeah. So I'll just slide back to that last slide here. But some of the things you might want to be looking for is, have you heard about those kind of overarching school-wide expectations or agreements? And is your child's classroom teacher using those within the classroom? Are they doing that explicit teaching of what does that look like and sound like? Are they giving opportunities for your child to practice those behaviors? Are they using an acknowledgement system that's working for your child with really frequent feedback? So I'll just give a quick example of my daughter's classroom. They have an acknowledgement system in place, and she did not earn her first acknowledgement for like a good month into the school year. That's not how it should be working. So at the beginning of the school year, students should be earning really frequently to let them know that they're on the right track, that they're showing behaviors that the teacher is looking for. And so that really frequent and genuine, right? You don't want to be giving it for nothing, but there's always something that you can acknowledge within what a student is doing. And when a challenging behavior does occur, so if your student or your child is having some challenging behaviors at school that are interfering with their learning, what's the response looking like? Are they simply getting punished? Are they losing recess? Or are they really being taught different skills and behaviors to use? And then if you're seeing or not seeing some of those things, providing that feedback to the teacher and to the administrator if kind of working with the teacher is not working.
Okay, Amy, and another question that came in before, I think you said you had a link on this, a question about adult
Yes.
PBS piece.
Yeah, so someone asked if we could focus on adult positive behavior support plans, and that wasn't unfortunately part of this webinar. But I did find this resource that might be successful about some tips and tricks for developing behavior support plans for adults. So I think Cassandra has that link too that she can put in the chat box.
So
And
thanks, Amy.
I'll stop sharing so that we can see anybody
See
if
folks.
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and read the questions from the chat, just to make it a little easier. So during the first 1 to 2 years of the pandemic, my kids checked in on a social emotional app called Close Gap.
Yeah.
Was that part of PBIS? Do you know what data and trends were gleaned from that?
Yeah, so it's possible that was part of their PBIS implementation. I know Cassandra's district, I think, used Close Gap in Champlain Valley, and a lot of other school districts did. And ideally, that would be something that their PBIS team was kind of overseeing and reviewing that data. And we didn't have statewide data on trends from Close Gap because that was kind of an individual district decision whether they were going to use it. But Cassandra, I don't know if you're still here and had any insights that were gleaned from Close Gap in your district.
Hi, everyone. Sure. And just to clarify, so as Amy had mentioned, PBIS is a framework, so we don't prescribe sort of what screener a school use. And there's certainly formal screeners, there's informal screeners. Close Gap is similar to, I would say, an informal screener, a quick check-in with your class every day to really get a sense on how students are feeling. And again, it's something that schools do their research on, and they say, gosh, we need to figure out how do we get feedback from our kiddos around how they're feeling. And so, yes, some schools do select Close Gap, others, there's several other ones out there as well. But again, that's really local data. It's data that we don't really have access to, but it's local data. And like Amy said, hoping that whatever screener schools are selecting, they're really utilizing the PBIS framework to analyze the data to really inform what practices they may need to employ within the cultural context of their school.
So folks can feel free also to unmute themselves if they have more follow-ups, but for now, I'll go down the list of questions that are in the chat. So what does this look like at the high school level? I feel there is a lack of support and options. Looking for additional supports to implement for my child at this level.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges is, like I said, there's that misconception that PBIS is just about the acknowledgement system, and people may have experienced an acknowledgement system that was something like, you get a warm fuzzy or like a little pom-pom if you are showing the behavior that we're looking for. And they try to picture something like that at high school and are like, oh, well, PBIS doesn't work at high school. And it definitely wouldn't work at high school if that's what you were doing. So when we're training high school teams, student voice is really key. So making sure that students are a part of building what does PBIS look like at their school, so that it meets that need for adolescents. And we know that adults provided feedback about behavior is not necessarily what's going to change their behavior, right? They're really looking to their peers to gauge how to interact. And so anything that is designed at the high school level and the middle school level really has to be about improving those peer-to-peer relationships, being able to give feedback to peers about what's working and what's challenging to the classroom environment, and building a culture that is really looking for those positive behaviors rather than kind of giving a lot of praise and attention to negative, challenging behaviors. So the short answer is PBIS can and should be implemented at the high school level. It's just a little bit more challenging because of those different needs of the students that are in front of them. But all schools in Vermont are required to have a multi-tiered system of support in place for academics and behavior, social emotional behavior. And so PBIS is one framework that schools utilize. I think when high schools don't access PBIS training, their social emotional behavioral kind of supports might be a little bit more lacking or loosey-goosey, and they kind of are just pulling things in. Okay, maybe this student needs a mentor, or maybe this student needs a social skills group, or one-on-one counseling, and it's maybe not designed in a really effective way that allows those supports to be put into place rapidly and effectively.
Okay, thanks, Amy. And just to clarify, schools do have to request the PBIS support if they want to use it.
Yeah.
Okay. How do you know if your child is getting tier 2 or tier 3 supports?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, you would have been part of that process from the beginning. So if someone at school identified that your child was having some challenges at school, someone from school would have reached out to you and said, I'm noticing that, Jimmy's having a really hard time with transitions within our classroom. We would love to try out X, Y, or Z, or we're noticing that, Sally's having some challenges with peer interactions. We would love for her to have, 6 weeks of a small group with our school counselor. They would have gotten your permission for that intervention to begin, and they would be giving you feedback about how it's going. So let's say after 6 weeks, they would let you know, like, here's the skills that we saw them develop. Here's what we're still working on. We'd love for them to stay in the group for another 6 weeks to be able to develop some additional skills. If they're on a check and check out plan, most of those plans also have a home component. So the families are looped in to let them know how their day is going. Some students who are receiving tier 3 supports might have a communication log that goes back and forth between home and school. So you likely would know if your child was receiving those tier 2 or tier 3 supports. But it never hurts to ask, and it never hurts to ask if you feel like your child isn't getting the support they need at school, that the things are kind of just, you're only hearing about things when things are going wrong. Asking, what supports are available for my child. It seems like they're really struggling. And sometimes the families know about struggles that are not showing up at school necessarily. So a lot of those behaviors that are more internalizing, so maybe your child is withdrawing, or they're feeling, sad or anxious or depressed, that might not be showing up at school in a way that's as noticeable as some of those externalizing behaviors. And so it never hurts to ask what's available, because often schools within that menu of interventions have supports for those externalizing behaviors, but also some supports for students who show more internalizing behaviors.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Students need to feel safe before they can regulate. What measures are centering signaling safety?
Yeah, so I think it probably depends school to school. We also, within our professional development calendar, we're kind of training in this larger PBIS framework, but we're also providing training in a variety of different areas, including trauma-informed schools, restorative practices. And one of our largest training events is at the end of June, called our BEST/Vermont MTSS Summer Institute. And we generally always have a training on trauma-informed supports offered by Joelle Van Len. So many of our schools have been, and staff have been through training with Joelle to really understand trauma-informed supports within schools, and develop those mechanisms for making sure that students feel safe, all students, not just those who have experienced trauma. I'm not sure about measures. There's definitely questions on the school climate survey that we offer schools that get at, do you feel safe at school? Do you feel safe going and coming from school? Do you feel safe talking to an adult at school, to try to get at some of that?
Okay, and is there any mechanism for evaluating the school's implementation of PBIS that is impartial?
Yeah. So the not impartial way is schools complete something called the tiered fidelity inventory. And that asks them to self-assess where they are in different areas of implementation of PBIS. So for instance, do more than 70% of your staff know and teach those school-wide expectations? And they can rate themselves on that measure. We have something called the learning walk, where we as kind of outside external providers can go in and do a learning walk at a school. The only mechanism for that to occur at this time is for a school to invite us in to do it. However, at the beginning of implementation, so when a school is first trained, we go in and do a baseline. And then we go in 6 weeks after implementation to give them some feedback about where we see those systems and practices showing up, and where they might still need to continue to develop those supports.
Okay. I actually have a question just in general. Here at the Vermont Family Network, we've seen a lot of calls that seem to reflect more absenteeism at school. So I'm wondering what the PBIS folks might be seeing in your work with, the factors that might be contributing to that, or areas that the schools can support students who seem to be experiencing this, inability to attend school.
Yeah. I think it depends on the grade level. So, generally when we're talking about elementary and early middle school students, generally that's a family. Something's going on within the family that's not allowing them to get that child to school, whether the child themselves is refusing or whether there's something in place where, something happening within the family that's making it challenging to allow their students to get to school. And then at, upper middle school, high school level, that's generally more a student level intervention that would need to occur because the student is choosing to not come to school for whatever reason. And I think the key piece is getting to the root of either of those issues, whether it's, a family challenge that's occurring or a student level concern that's occurring, what's really at the root of that and designing an intervention around that. So I don't think schools can design kind of a school-wide absenteeism, intervention, because it really is so unique to different students. If there are trends within the population of a lot of our students are not getting here because of X, Y, or Z, that could be more of a school-wide intervention. But without that kind of school-wide trend data, it's really important for those who are kind of tasked at the school with, overseeing attendance and improving attendance rates to really work with each family and each student to get to the root of those challenges.
Okay, thanks, Amy. So we are over time. Does anyone have any last questions? Again, feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask Amy anything. Okay, then thank you so much, Amy, for this helpful information. For everyone else, you'll see a link to the evaluation in the chat. Please take a few minutes to complete it so we can make improvements and fulfill our grant requirements. We have many more interesting workshops coming up, and you can find details about those on the homepage of our website, along with the links to previously recorded ones. So we have tons of information on our website. Getting connected with us is easy. So you can also sign up for our closed Facebook page that we have too for parents of children with disabilities, as well as our monthly e-news. Check out our YouTube channel. This workshop will be there within the week. And so we are here to help at the Vermont Family Network. Contact us by phone or email. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.